Welcome to the video where we're going to walk you through this pretty cool, mind-blowing thing known as a subquery. Now, subqueries, the first time you experience them, it's very possible that it's going to be a little confusing. And that's because a subquery is a query within a query, and hence the name subquery. So this is a query, select average from invoices, and it's sitting inside of another query. And this can be really confusing as you get into some of these really big, complicated subqueries, such as these down here, where we're going to be like running a query inside of a query, and that's going to be inside of another query. It gets really complex. What's important is when you're looking at subqueries and kind of learning them for the first time is to really kind of break them down to their simplest components. And that's what I'm going to do for you now as we walk through and explain how subqueries can be used. So in the example here, this is just to kind of get you started. Don't worry about so much at this point whether or not this would be something you would want to use a subquery to do this, but let's just actually look at what this statement is doing. So it's returning an invoice number, invoice date, and invoice total. It's returning that from the invoices table, where the invoice total happens to be greater than whatever the value is in this subquery. And so let's take this subquery and let's just kind of go run it by itself. So what we've done here is we have selected the average invoice total from the invoices table. And if I take this and copy this value out, that's the number, that's the actual average that's being stored here. Now, let me just gonna shorten this down to like a more reasonable number here. And basically, what this query is actually, when we run it, it gets processed by Oracle and it's then immediately stored as a value. So, and so this is the resulting value, 1879.74. Now, if I were to write this query out and go figure out what is the average of the, average invoice total, I could go in here and then once I know that value, I could just go in here and write this. So if you look at this query here, this probably makes a little bit more sense to you, because it's saying very simply, give me all these invoices where the invoice total is greater than this value. But from the standpoint of Oracle or the database, when you're running a subquery doesn't get processed any differently, or it's not seen any differently than the actual value. So let me explain what I mean by that. If I take this value here and I make it a subquery, all right, let's just let's get a little white space in here so you can kind of see what you're doing here. So this query here, which says give me all the invoice totals greater than 1879, let's see what happens. It returns 21 rows, and we'll remember this. If I run that same exact query, but instead of actually hard coding the value in, I'm actually just going to put the query that returns that value. If I run that, remember it's 21 rows. Again, we get the same result. And so when we go back to this original subquery, what I want you to start doing is looking at these subqueries as either a single value. Look at this one, it's definitely going to be a single value, right? If the select average. But as you go along further, you'll see that some of our subqueries will return multiple values, or it will return multiple rows. So it's either going to be returning a value or even a kind of a table of data, and then that will be used as kind of this subquery value in the overall query. So again, here, if I run this, greater than 1879, but that is the same thing as, grabbing this query here and making it the inner query to this kind of outer query. So this is kind of considered the outer query because this is inside of the query. And so when I look at this, I say, oh, wow, that's going to return one value. I know that just by looking at this query, because I know that when it says select average from invoices, it's just going to take the average and it's going to return a single value, which is why we can say invoice total is greater than, equal to, or whatever. and we could change this around if we wanted. We could actually say, give me all the ones where the value is lower, and sure enough it would. Here's everything less than 18, whatever it is. So that's what a subquery is there to do. And as we move along here, you're going to see me kind of take these subqueries out and kind of break them down into their subqueries, look at their values, and then kind of almost see what would happen if I replaced it with that hard-coded value. So let's go on to the next one, which is looking at subqueries compared to a join. So in this query, you've already done something like this before, where we assume that if you've made it this far, you've understood joins, you understood kind of the basic operators of the select statement. So in this select statement, it's joining invoices and vendors. It's an inner join, so we know that it's only going to pull the matches between invoices and vendors where the state is California. So if I run this, it's going to give me all the invoices for California, the invoice date and the total, and it's going to sort it by invoice date. Now, what we could do is we could also, we could pull all the invoices for the vendors that are in California. And so another way that you can write this, and you may not want to write it this way, so if some of you are kind of wondering, like, why would I write it this way if I can just do an inner join? If you can do a query without a subquery, you should definitely write it without the subquery. You only usually write subqueries when you have to, or when it just makes sense, it's just faster for you. At the end of the day, it's okay if you use a subquery, but I typically teach people to avoid using them until you absolutely have to. So in this scenario, we don't actually need the subquery, but what this is doing is saying, hey, let's go select the vendor IDs from the vendor table where the vendor state is California. And this is all of the vendors. There's 75 of them that are from California. So this list that we have here is now a subquery in this outer query. And notice here that we are saying where the vendor ID is in this. Now let me break this down and do an easier example. Let's do, I think, Arizona. I remember when we were playing with this. Yeah, so let's do this. Let's grab this one right here. So it's just a smaller list, and I think it'll make it easier for us to see what's happening. So when I grab this this query and I run it, it gives me a list, okay? 93, 96, 68. Now, I can make that a subquery but I can also treat it just like this. So what this subquery is doing is returning a list of values. And we already know that the end operator allows us to use a list. And so if I were to write this out, by now you probably know what this will do. It'll say, give me all the invoices where the vendor ID is in this list. And if I run it, here is the one invoice. So it looks like a couple of these vendors have not sent us an invoice, but one of them has. Now let's just do it like this. Let's take this exact query, but instead of, and I'm going to make sure that when you are putting a subquery, when you put it as an inner query here, you don't put a semicolon inside of it. But let's space this out so you can see what's happening. So what I'm doing here is, instead of providing the hard-coded list, I'm just going to provide the select statement, because maybe I don't want to go through and do what I just did and pull this actual list. I just want this query right here, which I'm just going to run this part of it. I want this, because maybe it'll change after a while. Maybe I add new vendors to Arizona. I don't want to have to go in and keep running this query and then adding, whatever number it is to it. So this query right here will always pull the current list of Arizona vendors. And so this query, when I hard code the list, will do the same thing as if I replace it with a subquery. So again, when you look at this, I want you to just think of it as, what is the output? And the output is this list. So SQL does not care if I am handing them a SQL statement inside of this this where clause. It doesn't care if it just, you say, hey, here's a SQL statement, go look up the list for me, and then feed that list into the rest of this query. You can do that, or you can feed them in the actual values. But that's the power of subqueries, is that we actually can go and run a query to get a list of values, or a value, and then feed that into another query. So look, I mean, the one thing that's cool about this is that, I mean, here I had to go look up the values and then type them in and hard code them. Here, I just basically provided two logical statements. I said, hey, go pull me all the vendors from Arizona, and then use that output to give me all of the invoices for those vendors. And I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty cool, because now this query is set to run and it will always pull me the invoices from Arizona. Over time, we're going to have more invoices from those three vendors, and we might get more vendors in Arizona. So when I run this, it's always going to return me the vendors of just these three the invoices for these three vendors. But this is always going to return all the invoices from Arizona vendors. And that's what is pretty cool. And, you know, it's kind of a more dynamic query, and it will last longer. So you can use subqueries in search conditions in different ways. You can, you know, use it, say, like we just did, which is I could just pull a distinct list of vendors. So again, I'm going to take this subquery out and I'm just going to run it for a second by itself. And this gives me the distinct list of vendors on the invoice table. So this means this is only the vendors that have sent us an invoice. And I could take that list. Now, I'm not going to copy paste this list out into this to show you what will happen. We just know, for example, hey, here's 34, 37. So here's a list of vendors. So when we feed that into this where clause here, it's saying pull me all of the vendors from where the vendor ID is not in this list. So what we're doing here is we're saying, pull me all the vendors where the vendor ID is not in the list of vendors that have sent me invoices. So this is saying, pull me all the vendors that have not sent me an invoice. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's run it. And sure enough, here is vendor 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's scroll down. We know that 34 and 37 sent us invoices, and that's why they're not on this list. So what we've done here is said, give me all the vendors who have not sent me an invoice. Now, you may be thinking, if you look at this next query, hey, we already know how to do this using a left join. We can say, give me all of the vendors and their associated invoice. Even if they don't have an invoice, I want you to pull it. And we could run that. But then we could say where the vendor ID on the invoice side is null. And if you remember in a left join, right, this is going to pull, if I do a left join, it's going to pull all the vendors regardless if, oh, hold on, let's pull like one thing here. Let's pull, so this is going to pull me all of the vendors and their associated vendor ID on the, I'll make this even easier. I'll pull their invoice ID. So it's going to say, give me all of the vendors, even if they don't have an invoice ID that they've associated to them. So here we know that IBM 34 has sent us 2 invoices. So what you remember, if you remember in the left join, what we can do, it's pretty powerful, is that we can say, hey, just pull everything on the left side. But if there is a null on the right side, you know, what that will do is it's basically pulling everything here that doesn't have a matching record on the right side, the invoice table. If I said not null, what that's doing is pulling everything on the left side of this query where there is not a null value in the invoice side. So this is everybody who has sent us an invoice. But if I go back here and say is null, this is effectively giving me a list of the vendors who are not that do not have an associated invoice on the right side here on the invoice table. So what we're showing you here is that, you know, some people, in fact, when I first learned to do left joining, I remember finding it kind of confusing because I just didn't practice the basic syntax of a join. So I would always remember it's, you know, it's table A joined to the table B on where the, you know, this key and this key match. And I think joins over time have become easier for me to use. And I think that, you know, this is a great way to just do this, is say, if I want to pull all the vendors, you know, that haven't sent us an invoice, you could just do that with a join and this null in the where clause. But if your brain thinks this way, you might say, I want to pull a distinct list of all the vendors from the invoice table, and then I'm going to go pull from vendors where the vendor ID is not in this list. So if you go back and run this query here using a subquery gives us the same thing as this right here using a left join. So neither one is right, neither one is wrong. I will say that when you do run subqueries, what actually is happening here is that this query is going to run first, and that's important to know. Subqueries are going to run the most inner query first, so it's going to go run and get this list. As soon as it does that, it's going to basically replace that query with a list of values here, and then it's going to run this query. So subqueries, the more complicated they get, the slower they can be. Whereas if I were just joining on this table, it might be faster. But because we don't have a lot of data here, and this isn't that complicated of a subquery, they do run pretty quickly. Let me show you one more example where we can actually use a subquery in a where clause, and that's where you can actually you can actually compare an expression. So again, if I break this down to its subquery, you will see here we're going to pull the invoice number, invoice date, and I'm going to clean this up so I can see it. I'm going to pull the invoice date and then this expression known as balance due. Let's just run it just for the heck of it, just to see what happens first. I really recommend always doing that. It's just when I see code, if I can get it to run, I just run it and then I start to break it apart. So it says where the balance due, because we know we can't use the balance due alias in the where clause. So it's greater than 0, and it's giving us this and clause here. So and the invoice or this balance due is less than the average balance due. So if this is kind of too confusing, let's run this by itself and let's see what this does. So again, if you look at this, we know that we can take the average of an expression, and we know that the average balance due on this table is 16,906. If I were to take this query and replace the subquery with just this value, all right, and to make it even easier to read, I'm going to kind of space this out. So what we've just effectively done here is this query ran and got us this value. And remember, in a subquery, the inner query is going to run first. So that query runs and it basically gives us this value. Then it replaces that subquery and then it runs this query with that value. So if I run this, it's going to say, give me all the invoices where the balance due is greater than 0. All right, so all of these are greater than 0. And it's less than 1669. And again, if you look at these, they are. But if you don't want to have to go through the effort of that, we can take that query. So once you write your subquery and you get it doing what you want it to do, all I have to do is take that and I go write my query and paste it in here. And then I run this guy. And the same thing, you'll see these balance dues are greater than 0, but they are less than that average we just went and looked up. Now, I know when you look at this, I mean, it gets complicated. So when things look complicated, break them down into smaller parts. Make sure that you're also spacing your code out in a way that's easy for you to see and understand what's happening. Some of you, you may want to kind of put the less complicated stuff on one line. But again, if your code isn't spaced and formatted nicely, it will be harder to understand subqueries. Let's talk about the all keyword. The all keyword is pretty cool because maybe what you want to do is you would like to look at a value. So again, let's just take this subquery and let's run it by itself. So I'm just going to run just this. And it's going to give me a list of values. The invoice total from invoices where the vendor ID is 34. So that means this vendor 34 has sent us 2 invoices for the following values. Now what I can do is I can actually, let's just going to rewrite this. And I'm going to grab these values here just so that we can. I've actually never done this with the all hard coding the values in. Let's see if this works. Interesting, it does. So what this does is effectively it says, give me the vendor invoice total from invoices interjoined to vendors. So we're pulling vendor and invoice information with this interjoin, where the invoice total on that vendor's invoice is greater than all of these values. Now, what that's essentially saying is it's greater than the largest value, right? Because if you think about it, it's saying when I pull these invoices, I only want to pull the invoices that is where it's greater than every value in this list. And to be greater than every value, you just need to be greater than the greatest value, right? So, I mean, if I say, hey, an invoice is greater than 116 and it's greater than this, that means it has to be greater than this. So, but again, this is just, you know, if I write this query and I say, give me a list of the, you know, I asked you to give me a list of the invoice totals for vendor 34, and then go pull me all the invoices that are greater than all of vendor 34's invoices, you would have to first, you know, go, okay, well, before I can pull a list of all the invoices that are greater than all of, you know, vendor 34's invoices, the first thing you have to do is say, okay, well, let me write a query that pulls the invoice totals for vendor 34. And so we would get that query to run, and just like we did here, we would run just this part. And then instead of taking those hard-coded values, we would then say, okay, now I want to pull all the invoices and the vendor information from where invoice total is greater than all of the values in this list. And again, this query is a list. Whether it looks like it or not, this query is going to run, and it's going to return a list, and then we're going to say greater than all of the values, and it's going to run that with that list in mind. Oop. And so this now returned the name, invoice number, and total, where the invoice total was greater than all of vendor 34's invoices, which I think was around $1,800. Well, let's go back. Let's just. Oh, no, 1,083, which makes sense because we were seeing some values in here that were like 15, but nothing below 1,083. And the next set of keywords you'll see are the any and some. And if you can think about this logically, this is saying, hey, you know, where a value is less than or greater than any of these values. So if I run this, this is returning vendor and invoice information where the invoice total is less than any of these values. So you'll see here these values, they seem to be kind of under the 25 range. Let's go look at what this actually returns, this inner query. So this the invoice total for the vendor 115's invoices, they've sent us 4 invoices, and their values are 6, 25, 6, and 6. So if I say, give me all of the invoices where the invoice total is less than any of these, then all it has to be is less than one of these values. So that doesn't mean it has to be a 4. If it's 24 or 25.66, then it technically meets that rule. So it only has to be, you know, less than the biggest value in this scenario. So, and if I did greater than any of these, right, we know that it would only show up things that are, oh, that's actually, so that makes sense too. If we say, pull me all the invoice totals where it's greater than any of these, well, all it has to do is be greater than 6, which is what we saw earlier. It, you know, it only has to be greater than one of these values, because that's, logically, when you read the English here, it kind of makes sense. It's saying, hey, give me the invoice total if it's less than any of these values. So it only has to be less than, you know, 25 point whatever. Also, I don't know why they do this, but some is also effectively the same thing. So you're not required to use any or some, but you know, grammatically, English-wise, it makes the same sense, right? I'm going to pull all the invoice totals where it's less than some of these values, or it's less than any of these values. That grammatically means the same thing. All right, so some other fun ways you can use subqueries is that you can actually put a subquery in the from clause. Now, this one I think is probably one of the harder things to grasp, but once we visualize, again, this query, so we can see the subquery right off the bat. You can just look at this and see, okay, there's a query, and then here's another query, because you can see that starts with select. Now, again, I want you to think about these queries as they are either a value or they are a table of values. And so in this one, I can already see that it's got a couple of columns, and we're going to bring me the vendor ID and the average invoice total of that for that vendor. And so I know that this is probably going to return a table. Like, what I mean by that is a couple of columns and maybe one or many rows. Because I know it's definitely going to have 2 columns. I don't know how many rows it's going to have. So let's just take this for a second and let's just run the subquery on its own. All right, so let's take this, we'll run it. And, you know, again, by now I assume you've already used having and where. So what we've done is we've grabbed the vendor ID and the average invoice total, but only the ones that have a higher, an average invoice total greater than 4,900. So that's why we can see that all these values are greater than 4,900. All right, so what we've done is produced a table, right? And this table, you know, it's not a literal table you see over here, but it's very much like a table of data. And so just like when we run a subquery and it returns a single value, and then when this inner query runs, it will like replace whatever value the output of that query is. It replaces that here. In this scenario, what we're actually doing is it's replacing it with a table instead of a value, a single value. So what we're doing here is, if you notice, we're actually putting it in here in the from clause, and we're saying from invoices join to this virtual table that we created. Now, I want to try something really quickly, and I want you to, let's take the subquery out and let's replace it with whatever value it is. Now, what I'm going to do is, you'll notice that they're saying from invoices join to this, you know, kind of virtual table that this query has created, and they're giving it a table alias. And then they're saying this will join on invoices vendor ID equals the v.vendor ID, so this virtual table vendor ID. So let's do something. Let's actually, instead of joining it to a subquery, let's make it into a table. And to do that, we've actually played around with this before when we messed with DDL, is let's go create a table, and I'm going to call it V, you know, just for simplistic sake, we're going to create table V, and then we're going to say as, and that should allow us to just create this table. Now, if you saw that it already existed over here, it's just because I had actually tested this out ahead of time and I just hadn't refreshed, but there it is. And if I click on this, I now have this table with a vendor ID and average invoice total, and there it is. This is what it actually looks like. So now, instead of us doing this with a subquery, I'm just gonna do it like this. I'm gonna take the subquery out, because now we don't actually have to join to a subquery. We're just gonna say go, it's gonna join invoices, and it's gonna be called I, and we're gonna join to V, which is the name of this table. And I'm just using the same name that they'd already used for the alias. So now if I ask you to look at this, right, does this make sense? Right, select some information, I, max invoice, average invoice, from invoices, interjoin to this new table that we've created called V, and invoices has a vendor ID, this table here has a vendor ID. So I should be able to do this and return the exact thing that we, oh, sorry, let's run just this part. And sure enough, we have gone and joined invoices, and it's basically pulling, it's pulling every invoice and it's mapping it to the vendors on this table. So we actually see it's 72, 99, 104. Let's go look at this query. Sure enough, we actually pulled the max invoice date, so that's the last invoice date, and the average invoice total for that vendor. So this is taking their averages. And so if we were to ask you to go and pull that query without a subquery, it might be hard, because what we might want to do is say, first off, I want to go and pull all the vendors where their average invoice total is greater than 4,900. And then once you find that list of vendors, I want you to then go and, for those vendors only, pull me their last invoice and their average. And that might be difficult to do. And so what we're doing here is breaking it down into kind of a more, smaller problems. So, so let's take this subquery back. And instead, what we're going to do is, instead of saying, go link to this table, what we're going to do is we're just going to put a set of parentheses here, because that kind of, makes sure that we close off, where the, where this whole table name exists. But as far as SQL is concerned, you could put a table name here, or you can go put something that defines a table. And what that essentially is doing is, we're running this, it's producing a table, and now we're actually, and not a literal table, but a virtual kind of table. And now it's going to join this to this table. So I know this looks a lot more complex, but let's run it. And it actually, let's see what I did wrong here. Oh, I know what we did wrong. When we defined this as a table, we needed to give it the table alias of V so that this would actually make sense. And here we go. Let's do this. And sure enough, that's the same thing. So when you're playing with subqueries, always remember that the inner query is going to run first. And sometimes it's better to just run that, see what it's actually producing, and that helps you get your head around it. Because again, if I gave you something like this, you would look at that and go, oh, okay, there's a table called vendors query, and I'm joining to this, here. But instead, if I replaced that table with a query output that looks like a table, and again, it has to have the vendor ID, because that's how we're going to join to the invoices table, that does the same thing. I mean, that to me, that's like so awesome. I think it's so cool. All right, so you can also use subqueries, not just in the from clause, but you can use them in the select statement. Now, this one's a little interesting because you're gonna have to start to get your head around this idea that this query that's running inside of this query, they can actually kind of pass information back and forth to each other from the outer to the inner query. And so when we look at this, we'll say, all right, select the max invoice from the invoice date, where the invoices.vendor ID equals the vendor ID on the V table. Now, the thing about this is that if I were to run this on its own, it's not going to work, right? Because this query can't stand on its own. You can't just say, go pull the max invoices from invoices, where the invoice ID equals. So the problem here is this, right? Is that there is no table with the table alias of V. This obviously can run. And if I had actually put in a vendor ID, if I said this, I said, give me the max invoice from invoices where the invoice.vendor ID is 34, that would be fine. But what we're doing here is saying where the invoice ID equals this. And so the reason, what we're doing here is, when we start to write this, it's going to go and select the vendor name from the vendor table. But the next thing it's going to give you is it's going to give me the max invoice from invoices where the invoice ID on this query matches the vendor ID that is being pulled in this query here. So the v.vendor_id refers to this vendor. So for every single row, and let's just do something really simple here. Let's take this out, and let's just put in a hard-coded value. And you know, if I ran this, it's going to produce all of the vendors in the vendor table. If I were to do something like this and say, give me the max invoice date from invoices, what that's going to do is it's going to give me the max invoice date from invoices, and it's going to put that, sorry here, it's going to put that max invoice date in every single row, because, you know, it's basically a hard-coded value. It's one value. There's only one max invoice on that table. And so for every single vendor on this table, it's going to go put that in there. But what we can do is add in this where the vendor ID equals the vendor ID here. And when we run this, this is going to give me the vendor name and the max invoice date where the vendor ID on that invoice matches the vendor ID on this outer query. Now, this to me is something that is harder to get my head around. And the other thing to point out here is that you could just do this with a simple join. So, you know, in this is probably one of those scenarios where is it valuable to do it with a subquery? I would say not, because basically all I want to know is I want to know the vendor and their latest invoice. But keep in mind what we're doing is we're selecting all of the vendors here, because I didn't put a where clause in here to say limit it to just vendors with invoices. I said pull me all of the vendors, right? If you just take this piece out here and run that, if we run this, right, it's obviously pulling all the vendors. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to pull the vendor and their max invoice, but if they don't have a max invoice, it's just going to show null. Well, we can do that same thing. We could just say, hey, do a left join between vendors on invoices. And so go pull me all the vendors and pull the vendor's name and that max invoice. And honestly, that does the same thing. It's going to pull all the vendors and their max invoice, including the vendors who don't have invoices. But this is just showing you how you can use a subquery in the select statement. You're allowed to do that. And in some cases, you know, you might want to actually, you know, pull, let's say, you know, we could go and pull a max invoice number and a min invoice number or something. We could actually go pull like some information about this vendor and then compare it to the max invoice. Maybe not even for the, you know, just in general. But just showing you again how we can use subqueries in the select statement. Now this last one that I'm going to show you is kind of a mind blow because it's complex and it looks confusing, but if we break it down, you'll see that it's actually not that complicated. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to the center of this query and I'm going to find the most subquery. And it's this guy right here. And because this code is formatted so well, I can tell that this is within this and this is within this. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this out and I'm just going to go run it and see what it's giving me. So the first thing we see here is that it's giving me the vendor state and the name of the vendor and the sub of the invoice total for that vendor. So this is summing up all of the vendor's invoices. All right, so we understand it's going to provide a table. And so if I go back here and you know what we see here is let's, and it's actually getting this summary to table alias. I'm going to start to kind of rebuild this for a second, but I'm going to assume, actually, if you want, let's do it this way. Let's go create, let's create table summary to as. I'm going to go do exactly what we just did before. Okay, we created the table. There it is. And there's my data. All right. Now, I'm going to back away from that. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to now, instead of joining to the subquery, I'm going to go join. So now let's look at what we've done here. We've actually gone and selected the vendor state and the max invoice total. All right, so let's run this by itself. All right, so now what we've done is from this table here, we've gone and looked at every state and vendor. We've then pulled the by state, we're going to pull the state and the max invoice total. So what this should do is give us the max by state. So if we look here like at Arizona, it's 662. If we look at California, it's 7125. So if I were to run this, right there we go, right there, it's going to actually provide the max by state. All right, so let's do this. Let's see what it's doing here. It's actually taking this subquery and it's defining it in a join as a table, and it's giving it this table alias of top and state. I'm gonna do the same little trick we just did before. I'm gonna actually go create a table based on that logic. So table definition, create table top and state as, all right, we're gonna run this. It's created. Let's refresh. There it is. All right, so now we've got a list of the max invoice by state. All right, so let's just go back now and let's just replace this. We have another subquery here that is being pulled in. So I'm actually gonna, and it's being called summary one. So let's just do it again. This time, I'm gonna go create summary one based on this definition. And if you want to see what that's doing, it's basically pulling the vendor state, the vendor name, and the sum of the invoices, which will be valuable when we want to bounce up against the other list that we have up here. So here we have all the state vendors in each state and their sum. But if we join that to this, we could actually join it on vendor state and invoices. And what we'd end up doing is having the name of that vendor that we could pull in. I'll show you what I mean here. All right, so now we've got summary one. All right, so let's look at what we've really just done. We've gone and selected from, so we are joining the summary table to the top and state table, and we're joining it on vendor state and the sum of the invoices. And so we are, let's go pull, let's refresh this one last time. So now what we've done is we have joined this table to, let's go, so we pulled this. And by the way, if I asked you to go and say by state, pull me the max invoice, it'd be hard to write a select statement from this. I can't just say go pull the state and the max. It's going to pull the max of this entire set of values. But if I actually have this set here, I know the max by state. And now over here, I know every, vendor in that state and their value. All I have to do is find where the state and the value on this list matches the state and the value on this list, and it will end up providing me, like we'll go find, okay, for California, and here's the value that matches. We know that's Digital DreamWorks. So for Arizona, it's pretty easy because it's Arizona 662. So let's go run this query and let's see what it returns. So what we now have here is a query that returns the state and the name of the vendor in that state who has the max invoices. Now, if you are thinking, wow, that took a lot of work for us to have to go and do that, I want you to think about whether or not we would be able to do that without subqueries. Because as you start to dig into some of these complex queries, you'll start to realize that you just can't do it in one single query. And let's come back here to this query. So what this query was doing is it says, go pull me the name of the vendor in every state who is the top, has the highest number of invoices. So if I were to start to do that, it might start going, okay, well, let me just go pull, let me go select star from, so we want vendor and invoice data. So I'll pull vendor from vendors, inner join invoices, and we'll say on, I'm going to put my alias in here just to make this go faster. So let's try this. Let's just explore this. Vendor ID equals vendor ID. I think I said this right. All right. So from there, I could say, all right, I want to know the vendor. Let me just pull a couple of things in here that I know I want, like vendor ID, vendor state. I want the vendor name, and I want their invoice total. All right, so we could pull that in here. Oh, I'm going to get an ambiguous error here on that. I should have seen that coming. All right, so now that I've got this information, I would have to start thinking about, okay, well, I could group by, this. So let's go here and let's group by this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the sum of the invoice total here. All right, let's keep playing with this. Let's see if we can get down to it. Let's see here. We're going to pull in this. Oh, sorry, there we go. Some of you who are watching this video will probably knew exactly what I did wrong there. All right, cool. Now we've got, and just to make this easier to see, I'm going to order by vendor state. All right, so it's easy to find the max invoice total for Arizona, but now how do I get the max by state? Because if I go in here and add in the max invoice total, right, the problem with that is that it's going to end up giving me the max invoice total, at this vendor state name level. So that doesn't work. Then I start to think, well, can I select the max invoice total? I don't know if I can do this, but I'm going to try. This is what's fun about SQL. You just experiment when you kind of are starting out. So let's select this from the invoices table where invoices dot vendor ID. And again, this isn't going to work because if I pull the max by vendor ID equals, what I was thinking was like, could I do it in this select? Could I go pull where the vendor ID here? It's going to give me the same thing. It's just it's going to basically pull the max for that vendor. And so this is where what we really need to do is, once I have, this set of values here, and I know I've got, the state and this, then what I really have to do is I have to kind of go and get, by state, I have to, get, by state and the max of that state, which is why this is where we actually start to, start with our, let's call this summary 1, and let's say I want to select star from. So remember, I can make a table based on this, and I'm going to call that table summary 1. So I can just say select from, and then everything in this parentheses is the actual table. So if I run this, Now it's giving me the same thing, but now what I can do is I can select from this table that I've created. So now I could go and say, give me the vendor state and the max of, and what we'll do is let's give this an alias really quickly. Let's call it invoice sum. And so let's just run this one more time, make sure that runs. Just the inner query. Okay, cool. So now I call it invoice sum. So now I'm going to take the max of invoice sum. Let's run this guy. So so what I've done is, all right, remember this is kind of my from, my inner from. And now what I need to do is I need to group by this vendor state because it's a non-aggregate column. So now I'm going to go in here. Look at that. See, now I know by state what's the max invoice by state. And so this is actually what's in this upper query up here, is you'll actually see this part here becomes the table that we need. And then what we end up doing is we go back later and we run another query, and it ends up providing this, let's see here if I can just run this inner part here. So what we've done here is we have created kind of two sets of tables, and when we bounce them off of each other, that allows us to find the name of the vendor and their max invoice. So we can, so what I hope I've kind of shown you here is that as you start to program a query, you may run into a problem where it's like, I don't know how to do this, and I have to really create kind of sub tables and put them within, as subqueries within another query. I don't expect you, after going through this, to be able to just right on the fly be able to like start writing subqueries, but I want you to get your head around the concept of how we would have to use them, and maybe when we are limited in what we can do in one select statement and when we'd have to start doing it. So again, when you start looking at subqueries, I always recommend, start with the most inner query. Remember, this is the query that's going to run first, and run that to see what's happening, what's returning. And remember that when Oracle or SQL runs, it's going to run the inner query and then translate that to the value or table that it is, and then it will use that inside of the outer query. We're going to stop there. If you have any questions, let us know on the discussion board, and we're happy to help. But hope you enjoyed this.